You'll have to forgive me, I'm not entirely comfortable sitting down speaking. It always seems rather odd to me. My career...
Feel free to stand up.
I've been a criminal barrister for the last 25 years, and my day job sees me mainly defending miscreants, or at least those accused of being miscreants, up and down this country. I also sit as a recorder in the Crown Court and as a coroner. But I have had the great good fortune and privilege to have prosecuted and indeed defended in criminal cases on St Helena and on the Falkland Islands. And I've been asked to give you what are unabashedly personal observations on my experience of criminal practice in these two very small jurisdictions. There is no real hard data and few objectively verified studies about the South Atlantic Overseas Territories and the practice of criminal justice there. There is significantly more work done in the Caribbean jurisdictions, and in reality one only needs to look at what's really the textbook about overseas territory law, Hendry and Dixon, to realise how little academically there has been interest in overseas territory law. That is a book which is entirely black letter, with very little, in fact, by way of what the jurisprudential development is in those overseas territories. They are remote, they are small, and they are enormously important because they provide a lens to understand common law jurisdiction developing in isolation and a long way from the main homeland of common law, which is the United Kingdom. Although I suspect the Americans might think that they are the homeland of common law. But when I first sailed to St Helena to take up post as Locum Crown Counsel, it was with a real sense of professional foreboding. I'm not sure at that stage I had ever travelled somewhere that you could only get to by sea. And as the post boat pulled away from the island, I realised I was there for at least a month and a half until it came back. And I have to say, I wondered for the 10 days out of Cape Town what sort of post-colonial time warp, 5 days out of Cape Town, what sort of post-colonial time warp I'd let myself in for. I loved it. I loved the people, and I loved the jurisdiction. In fact, I was due to be there for a month and a half. I ended up being there for nearly 4 months. I loved it so much that when the opportunity came to work on the Falkland Islands, I welcomed that opportunity with open arms too. I am entirely certain that there are people who have professional horror stories about working in such small jurisdictions. Professional horror stories which focus on unprofessionalism, that focus on the problems, that focus on the lack of resources. But my abiding sense of both the Falklands and St Helena is that they are places where criminal justice truly matters to the people who live there. Because they are small. Because they are small, everyone is touched by the criminal law in a way that they are not touched by it in a larger jurisdiction. If you live in the United Kingdom, and you are middle class like me and live in a fairly nice area, your experience of crime will generally be through the media. You won't have a distant cousin who's a suspect, a close friend who's a jury member. You won't go drinking with the senior magistrate. You won't see every single police officer in the one shop every Saturday, desperately trying to buy the only lemons in the jurisdiction. The motto of the Falklands is desire the right. And in both places, both St Helena and the Falklands, that sense of wanting to see justice done is very strong and runs through all of the population there. As I hope I can show you, that desire is weighed down by problems and worries about how in practice criminal justice should work, but it is a theme which runs through all the people involved in the system on both islands. I say islands, of course, Falklands is a large archipelago, there are a large number of islands, but it should be said, however, that whilst there is that desire, the criminal justice system on both the Falklands and St Helena recognise that desiring the right isn't just about importing English law and doing things the way they will be done in English courts. That is not the concept, and that is not what the people who live there feel. I'm going to say a little about both jurisdictions and then focus a little on the jury system, which is my greatest experience out there. I'm sure you will all have heard of some of the British Overseas Territories, particularly when something happens which is newsworthy for our own island population. The Overseas Territories tend to gain their appearances before the British media only when something goes horribly wrong, or when someone invades them, or when there's been some terrible scandal. But there are 14 British Overseas Territories. They are the remnants of what was once the British Empire. It's perhaps of interest to note that Britain is the only country to still have territories on every continent except Australia. These 14 dependent territories are all very different from each other, but they retain the UK retains constitutional oversight and authority over defence, foreign relations and security. But they do, however, have a significant degree of local autonomy. While all the British Overseas Territories follow English common law to some extent, it is in variable degrees depending on local circumstances, often depending on who they're close to. The BVIs are very close to America, and their understanding of the common law is far more American than it is English. Obviously, some overseas territories have no population, or a population of 10 scientists. Some have populations that are entirely military, sometimes not always English military. So my focus is going to be on the two territories of which I have personal experience and knowledge, Falklands, St Helena. Both are constitutional democracies. They are constitutional democracies in miniature, with elected legislative assemblies the size of some parish councils. That does not make them irrelevant. In exactly the same way, when you look into a terrarium, you see how plants grow. When you look into a terrarium, you see a forest in miniature. These tiny democracies are not dissimilar. They have their own distinct laws, but they also both have mechanisms for adopting UK law. Both the Falklands and St Helena are important also for study because they have a significant criminal caseload. Let me underline what I mean by that. By significant, I do not mean numerically significant. Both the Falklands and St Helena must, on any calculation, be some of the most law-abiding places on earth. Certainly some of the safest places on earth. Rather cynically, someone on the Falklands once said to me, well, no one's going to steal anything here, where are they going to go? I think it runs a lot deeper than that. I think a sense of a community who has grown up in isolation, reliant on each other, has a far more profound concept of adherence to social norms than perhaps we do in a larger jurisdiction. So what do I mean by significant? I mean that there are a few cases of the utmost seriousness. You will be aware that in small isolated communities there are occasionally cases of the utmost serious involving violence or sexual offending. And so that's why I say significant. To understand both places, you do have to understand a little of the history. I say that because the history of a place necessarily shapes the understanding of where it goes and what Leo described as the starting point as well. History leaves scars. And in a very small jurisdiction, history, it is not possible to simply ignore it in the way that one might growing up in a larger jurisdiction. When every walk takes you past somewhere of significance. Every time you walk along the main road in Stanley, you know that that was the road that the Argentine invasion force drove down to besiege and ultimately capture the governor's house. You know it if you're of a certain age in this country because you saw it on the front page of every newspaper. But when you live there, that history weighs on you every day. It's a constant reminder. So, the historical context. St Helena was discovered by the Portuguese. They discovered pretty much everywhere in the 1500s. It was then seized by the Dutch, and finally the British wrestled it from one armed Hollander, his servant, and a goat, what would have been left as a colonial force. Then that paragon of colonial virtue, Oliver Cromwell, handed the entire island over to the British East India Company. And aside from a short tussle with the Dutch East India Company, they wanted their goat back, and a brief period when the island was the retirement home of Napoleon Bonaparte, it remained in company hands until 1833, when the British government took control of the island because they saw it as a good spot from which to launch raids against the transatlantic slave trade. It was a vital resupply port in the age of sail. Until the advent of steam and steel. Ships were refitted there almost every day on the trip to India and the wider empire. Some of the wealthiest trading houses in London had offices in Jamestown. the Americans opened a whaling commission there. There was an Admiralty Corps. It was of huge significance. Napoleon still got his wine from France. And in the 1890s, British papers, London papers were arriving there within 5-day sail by fast packet across Europe and then across. But with the advent of steam, it became a maritime backwater. The money left. There were brief attempts to rebuild the economy. Flax was imported from New Zealand. It was a failed enterprise because there wasn't the port structure to export it. And so the population of St Helena is made up from people from very diverse heritages, from all across what had been the British Empire and all across Africa. And when the wealth disappeared within 2 decades, their economic development was arrested, and there was a sense that it had been left behind. And that profound sense of having been forgotten leaves a scar. Whilst the criminal law on the island is similar to UK law, it's not the same. Clearly, many of the more serious offences are the same. They're the same across every society. It's similar enough to catch out the unwary, like me on occasions. But it's important to note that local law has grown organically, just as it does in every common law jurisdiction. For example, bad character, in fact on both St Helena and Falklands, is a novelty which is still treated with judicial suspicion. St Helena has its own court structure. First instance, magistrates, including lay magistrates, the senior magistrate, who has a significant jurisdiction. There's the Supreme Court. It also has its own Court of Appeal. Of course, its Court of Final Appeal is the Privy Council. The Falklands has a very similar structure, but has a very different history. Settled by the French, Spanish, the populace of Buenos Aires, and the English. It's a settlement of bluntly tough adventurers who sought out a new life on the edge of the world. Far from becoming a backwater, it was isolated from the start. It was an economic project. Some people became wealthy, some people found the freedom that they desired, others did not. But rather like St Helena, it also became somewhat forgotten. When canned lamb and wool were no longer important, when the Royal Navy no longer needed a coaling station to be able to dominate the South Atlantic, it too lost importance. Unlike St Helena, it had the misfortune of being invaded.
Recording in progress.
I'm very pleased. It became forced into the British psyche and into the British experience. Until the conflict, Falklands was pretty much forgotten. And it brought this community of tough, self-reliant individuals into the consciousness of the UK public, and it meant that their jurisprudence had to develop, that had been developing slowly, much more fast. It created a haphazard tumble of legislation that had to catch up with the world quickly. So, both populations, for different reasons, historically had, I perceived when I was there, and I might be wrong, a suspicion historically of the whole-scale adoption of UK law. The sensation was that the criminal law was an expansion of colonial control, an expansion that was keenly felt. I had the privilege on St. Helena of talking to some of the older citizens who felt that really the imposition of UK moral values on them through the criminal law was an unwanted assertion of superiority after so long failing to take account of the needs of the island. It was patronising. It was a failure to recognise that they were already developed morally, socially, sophisticately. They were morally sophisticated. They had their own moral compass. Why did they need someone to tell them what should or shouldn't be done? Even when that law mirrored exactly what they were thinking anyway, there was a suspicion. That's historically. I don't think it's necessarily the case now, and in my experience, people at Jamestown, when I was in front of them as jurors, were some of the keenest judges of fact and fairest assessors of the case against them that I've ever had the privilege to appear in front of. A similar fear, I think, existed on the Falklands, that somehow their protected, idyllic isolation was subject to the imposition of external law, which was a patronising failure to appreciate the island's ability to govern themselves. So in the UK, the criminal law doesn't have to justify itself as being relevant. To a greater or lesser extent, we accept that criminal law protects our society. But when the criminal law is imposed externally, it can perhaps be seen as much of it as an attack on a society as a protection. I say all of that because the ability to run and administer their own courts is rightly a source of real pride in the overseas territories. They take pride in their system being theirs and that it serves them. Alongside that is an understanding, both in St. Helena and the Falklands, that maintaining their distinct legal identity should not mean that they are excluded from the wider common law family. The development of jurisprudence that I saw was that tension between a desire to be part of the family but to be distinct as well. And this recurring theme that people living at the edges of our overpopulated world should have the same access to justice, the same legal rights as anyone else, is utterly vital to any understanding of what happens. As an external advocate instructed to carry out cases in the overseas territories, I realised very swiftly that whilst we might be able to provide expertise not present on the island, the only way to successfully do that is to recognise that fierce concept of a distinct legal jurisdiction that lives within the family, not subsumed by it. So why is there this fierce sense of why the criminal law matters in these small jurisdictions? Well, I don't know. I can only say what I've experienced and what I feel. And that is that simply everything in the overseas territories is far more immediate. Crime occurs, you don't need a newspaper on the Falklands or on St. Helena. In a population of around 5,000 civilians, everyone knows. Everyone will know the fugitive victim. Everyone will know the defendant. Lawyers don't have the same anonymity. I've worn half a pound of horsehair on my head in 42-degree temperatures in Jamestown and in 50-mile-an-hour gusting winds on the Falklands. And whereas here, you wear a wig and you walk into the street and nobody really recognises you, it provides you with no anonymity in such small places. The scrutiny for your decisions is a public scrutiny, not the scrutiny of some distant court of appeal or a judicial review. It is the man who walks up to you in a cafe and says, "Why did you drop that case?" That's why it matters, because it's so much more immediate. But it also forces lawyers involved in the system to be much surer of their decisions. They cannot simply hide behind process, cannot simply hide in their office. And in my view, it makes for better decision making. And it is
Recording in progress.
It's not got bored of me yet. For the most serious offences, both on St. Helena and the Falklands, they have trial by jury. And this trial by jury is and should be genuinely perceived as an opportunity for the people in small jurisdictions to have a stake in criminal justice, so that it is not just some imposed post-colonial system, but in fact part of a right, a privilege and an obligation to take personal responsibility for criminal decisions. And in my experience, that is the way that jurors see it there. They take it enormously seriously. The fear from the UK is that everyone's too close. Everyone knows everybody. No one can be objective. In fact, careful jury questionnaires normally, which consider whether you know somebody, now in small jurisdictions consider how well the juror knows them and whether they feel able to fairly try the case. Those jury questionnaires are responded to with startling honesty. Startling honesty by people who intrinsically understand that they are being asked to objectively judge their peers, because they know that it's so important that when they go to the supermarket, somebody will know that they were involved in that judgment. I remember distinctly a juror on St. Helena who said, "I know him, he's my cousin, we ain't too close, and anyway, I know he did this, so I best not be on the jury, eh?" That shows a very clear understanding of the fact that there is a distinction between him being related to him and also his ability to try it fairly, an intrinsic understanding, and the arrogance to presume that because it's a small jurisdiction people are not capable of objectively judging their peers is an error that we should not make. I strongly believe that juries in small jurisdictions are both achievable, are fair, and are ideologically hugely important. How can you say to people in small jurisdictions, we think it's important that you have the rights, privileges and obligations that everybody has in other jurisdictions, but you're not allowed to have juries? People in the UK can have juries, you can't have juries. Well, mind you, not if somebody has their own way.
but that's a good example. How viscerally do you feel the idea in the United Kingdom that juries are going to be taken away from you? You who have never had any real interaction with the criminal jurisdiction, other than academically. How much more so to take it away from people for whom that is their stake in a justice system that might ordinarily be seen as imposed upon them. In practice, they are fair. I've dealt with cases involving very senior police officers, British servicemen accused of attempted rape of locals, and the fair way in which juries appraised and judged them, I'll admit, surprised me. But fair they were. They take their involvement seriously and personally. So that's the trial process. Can I very briefly touch on, in closing, a personal observation about sentencing and rehabilitation? And it really came out of something that Leo's just said about what the aims of sentencing and rehabilitation should be within a criminal justice system, how they are achievable, and how the aims and goals don't change, but the way you get there is very different. If one thinks about a man who is sentenced, completes their sentence, and then has to reintegrate into society in a way that the society feels continuingly protected, potentially from any future transgression by that person. What better example than seeing a man convicted of a serious offence in a very small community, who has to go out and live in that community, and the members of that community have to live cheek by jowl with him and feel safe. I have seen the experience of a former police officer convicted of misfeasance in a public office, namely using his status as a police officer to force two older women to go on dates with him, cook him his dinner, and in respect of one of them, sleep with him. He was imprisoned.
Recording in progress.
And on his release, he wasn't shunned, wasn't isolated. He carried on doing odd jobs, building, including for his victims. But his son was always with him. So he was supervised and rehabilitated. All the things that ultimately now probation is developing to be able to do in smaller jurisdictions. But that desire to reintegrate, those mechanisms of reintegration exist long before there is a formalised way of doing it. And it's whether the formalised way of doing it can latch on to all of the values of the system. So I hope that hasn't been too tedious, and I haven't descended into too many war stories, of which I have far too many of them. But I think probably my favourite thing about working in very small jurisdictions has got to be that at 5 in the morning you can go out fishing, come back with a tuna, leave it in your hotel, go to court, and come back and have sushi. Everything else rather pales into insignificance when you can do that. Thanks very much. Apparently we've got question and answer now.